What happens when older, more traditional values get challenged by younger, more modern values? This is exactly what happens in the 1920s. So stick around for Mr. E's Classroom because that's what we're going to take a look at today. Hey guys, welcome to Mr. E's Classroom. Today we're going to look at the culture clash that happens in the 1920s between traditionalists and modernists. Specifically, we're going to look at the answer of how did traditional and modern views differ in the 1920s. So grab a pencil and paper and get ready to take some notes. Pay attention to this video and hopefully by the end you'll have an answer to that question. Something we have to talk about before we even get started is division that starts to happen in the 1920s. What you start seeing in the 20s is that more Americans are living in urban areas versus rural areas. This is something that's totally new here in the United States. Just remember that urban areas are basically the cities or suburbs. The rural areas are basically the country. To understand this culture clash, we kind of need to understand where both sides are coming from. Let's look at the modernists first. These are people that are living in the urban areas or the new developing suburban areas. They typically tended to be a little bit wealthier. They typically tended to be people that were participants in this new consumer culture that's starting to happen in the 20s. For the modernists, education was extremely important. Modernists were also embracing science. In the 1920s, you start to see a whole lot of new sciences show up. And the modernists are the people that start to embrace what scientists are having to say. They tend to be less focused on religion or religious aspects of life. On the flip side, the traditionalists tended to be the people that were more rural oriented. They were people that still lived in the country. They typically tended to be a little bit poorer. They tended to be what we would consider to be stuck in the old ways. Education for traditionalists wasn't that big a deal. Religion always trumped science for traditionalists. And a lot of traditionalists are what we would call fundamentalists. Education plays an incredibly important role in this culture clash that we start to see in the 1920s. It's kind of important to understand where both sides were coming from with regards to education or how they viewed education. On one side you had the rural attitude towards education. Basically they thought that the 3 R's were important. That's reading, writing, and arithmetic. For the most part, as far as the rural attitude goes, farm knowledge was far more important than what they would call book learning. The knowledge you needed to survive out in the country was how to run your farm. That's not something you learned from books. That was something you learned from experience that a father would pass on down to his son or a mother would pass on down to her daughter. Stuff like that. The urban attitude towards education was a little bit different. Urbanites did tend to believe in the 3 R's. They were a good solid foundation to start with. But in the urban attitude, mental ability was better than physical ability. What you could do with your mind trumped what you could do with your body. The urban attitude of education believed in mastery of math and language over just about anything. If you were good with numbers and you were good with words, that meant you could get a great job. If you had a great job, that meant you had some good money. And in the urban areas, if you had money, you were going to survive. I mentioned earlier that the traditionalists tended to be fundamentalists. So what exactly is a fundamentalist? A fundamentalist was a Christian who believed that the Bible was literal truth. Anything you needed to know, you could find it in the Bible. And if it wasn't in the Bible, you didn't need to know it. They thought that the Bible was the key to both moral answers and scientific answers. Fundamentalists were very skeptical of a lot of the new science or the new scientific theories that were popping up in the 1920s. This tended to be a more rural attitude. Fundamentalism was incredibly popular out in the country with more traditionalists or the older generations. This guy right here, John Scopes, he was a modernist living in a rural setting in the 1920s. What he did basically became the central battle between traditional and modern in the 1920s. What I'm referring to is the Scopes trial of 1925. John Scopes was a school teacher. He taught in Dayton, Tennessee. He actually taught science. Biology was one of his main classes. In the 1920s, in fact in 1925 when all this goes down, there's a law in Tennessee that forbids the teaching of anything other than creationism as scientific fact for how we got here. Creationism is basically the Bible story of God said and poof, it happened. In 1925, there was kind of an up-and-coming wave of people who believed in evolution. And Scopes decided to teach his students the theory of evolution as developed by Charles Darwin alongside of the creation story. That broke the law. Scopes was arrested and there was a trial over it. This trial becomes the ultimate clash of modern versus fundamentalist. It gets the nickname the monkey trial because of that whole idea of evolution and man came from a lower form of mammal and evolved. So why did this tiny little trial in middle of nowhere Dayton, Tennessee become such a big deal in 1925? Well, part of the reason is because it had a huge nationwide following. One of the up-and-coming inventions in the 1920s that we'll get to later is a thing called the radio. And of course we also had telephones that were pretty prominent of the day. And because of things like the radio and telephones, newspapers were easily able to cover what happened in the Scopes trial. It also really highlighted the cultural divide that was happening between a younger generation of Americans and an older generation of Americans. And both sides adamantly believed that they were in the right. This trial also had two celebrities involved. The first was a guy named Clarence Darrow. He was kind of the trial lawyer of the day. If you needed a lawyer to help you out in court, Darrow was the guy you wanted to get. People all over the country knew that name. Darrow also kind of adopted this new modern idea of things are going to be changing and I might as well change alongside with them. The other major celebrity involved was a guy named William Jennings Bryan. You should remember that name. We've talked about him a few times. He was the guy that founded populism. He ran for president a few times. Darrow is brought in as a defense attorney for John Scopes. And William Jennings Bryan is brought in to help the prosecution. Bryant was also one of the leading fundamentalists of the day. He was like the fundamentalists' fundamentalist. These two guys, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, are the reason the Scopes trial was as big as it was. People all over the country wanted to see these two guys duke it out over this idea of evolution. Darrow was trying to defend Scopes for teaching it, and Bryant was basically trying to prove that evolution was a bunch of hogwash and shouldn't be taught. In a lot of ways, this trial was kind of rigged from the very get-go, in that most of the people in Dayton, Tennessee were adamantly fundamentalist, and they definitely believed everything that William Jennings Bryan had to say when it came to the court case. Little known fact about this trial, though, what a lot of people don't know, is that William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow were actually pretty good friends, big buddies. Darrow had helped William Jennings Bryan twice when he campaigned for president, and this kind of was also a friendship put to the ultimate test. So what was the outcome of this sensational trial that happened? Well, Scopes did clearly break the law that Tennessee had. Because of doing so, he was fined $100. Eventually, the ruling did get overturned on a clerical technicality, and later on down the road, the law that said you couldn't teach evolution in Tennessee is declared unconstitutional and gets thrown out. But Scopes did break the law. He was guilty of doing that. Modernists really won the day, though. Clarence Darrow actually called William Jennings Bryan to the stand to be a witness for the defense. This shocked everybody. This was like unheard of. How could the leader of the fundamentalists be used as a witness for the defense? Darrow did something really interesting. William Jennings Bryan had entered into evidence his own personal Bible. Darrow asked William Jennings Bryan if he believed every single thing that was in that copy of the Bible he introduced as evidence. And as a response, Bryant said, "Sure, of course I do. It's in the Bible. It has to be 100% true." What Darrow didn't quite realize was in the front of the Bible, there was a little section about some scientists and some clergy that had gotten together and decided that they could figure out how old the earth was. A guy named Bishop Archer was the one who came up with the number, and he said that the world was only about 6,000 years old. This was printed in the Bible that William Jennings Bryan had entered into evidence. And through questioning, Clarence Darrow asked William Jennings Bryan, "Well, do you really believe that the world is only 6,000 years old?" And William Jennings Bryan says, "No, I really don't think it's 6,000 years old. I think it might be older." That proved the point. Clarence Darrow basically got the fundamentalists to say what's in the Bible isn't exactly 100% factually true. And that kind of destroyed the whole fundamentalist idea that every single thing that's in the Bible was literally true. And this kind of shocked people all over the place and made all sorts of news stories that the fundamentalist leader is saying the Bible is wrong. And yeah, it is kind of a technicality, but what the modernists kind of got the fundamentalists to admit is maybe everything in that Bible isn't 100% literally true, and there might be some things to learn that aren't necessarily in the Bible. This kind of creates almost a snowball effect, and slowly through the rest of the 1920s, more and more science starts to pop up, and new theories about all sorts of stuff start to pop up that people start to grasp onto. What should you take away from this video? Well, number one, remember that by the 1920s, more Americans are living in urban areas than rural areas. That was something brand new. Number two, remember that urban areas were home to more modern ideas. The rural areas were home to more traditional or fundamentalist ideas. The third thing you need to take away from this video is that the 1925 Scopes trial really was the showdown between fundamentalist traditional ideas and more newer modernist ideas. There you go, guys. The culture clash of the 1920s, traditional versus modern. Hopefully you got good notes, and hopefully you're going to be ready for that quiz when it happens in class. As always, till next time, guys, remember, don't stop learning.